So I hope you're enjoying this Mary Magdalene series. This is part 2. And we're, by the way, Women Seeking Wholeness podcast. I'm Cherie Burton, your host. This is actually a podcast for women who are waking up to who they actually are. And we've been talking about soul sovereignty. We've been talking about the mysteries of the divine feminine. We've been talking about changes on the earth and how this is kind of the time. I mean, a lot of people are entering what we call the dark night of the soul. And that's actually like a healthy thing. It could be like a faith crisis. It could be like systems crumbling, structures crumbling, old ways of doing things, old paradigms. Really, we're bringing in a new era. And it is the era of the feminine. It's kind of like us coming out of this huge dark ages. I've got Amber Richardson today for our second part. We haven't met in person. She's younger than I am. She's super smart. I don't know. We met through a mutual friend named Michelle. And Michelle said, I think you should interview her for your podcast. And it's so happened that as we were continuing our conversation, I realized she had this really cool connection to the Magdalene. I think she just recently had a retreat or something on the Magdalene, and I was going to come, but I wasn't able to make it. But she has these gatherings and she's talking about, feminist critical theory, and she's talking about people really communing with Mother and how it doesn't take away from God the Father to connect to the female counterpart. What we discovered together in our discussion, which I think you'll really like, is that Mary Magdalene is kind of the female counterpart of the Christ. And so she's really been dragged through the mud historically, but I think she's making a comeback. I know she is. This particular episode is about Amber's experience with abuse and how she was able to tap into the divine mother or feminine essence of the divine from a spiritual standpoint to heal and to get that sustenance and nourishment and nurturance that her spirit needed. I encourage you to share this with your friends. We've got really cool episodes coming up in our 6-part Mary Magdalene series by women all over the world who are really diving into this research and this new way of ascending into the feminine. And Mary Magdalene is kind of our prototype to understand how to be in our bodies and heal and connect and shine. All right. Well, welcome, Amber. And so grateful that you've taken time to share with us some of your thoughts and experiences as we engage on this Mary Magdalene series.
Thank you, Cherie. I'm so excited to be connecting with someone who has a similar interest and love for Mary Magdalene.
And you and I kind of talked a little before this about how she seems to be kind of popping up on people's radars. And I would love for you to share we'll get to her, but anything relevant to your journey that it would help our listeners get to know you a little bit more and kind of where you've been, where you are, what you've been through, and kind of where you're headed now.
Absolutely. I can do that. So I was raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I'm still a practicing member. I was born in California and raised in Idaho, moved to Utah 10 years ago to attend Brigham Young University, where I majored in theater. And within my course of study, I focused on oral storytelling and have had opportunities to perform at the Timpanogos Storytelling Festival and the Vernal Storytelling Festival, and have kind of made it my life's work to add to the healing of the world using the medium of storytelling. So currently I am collaborating on a photography book called Woman Crowned that depicts, thank you. It depicts queens in the scriptures using photography and prose. And we're exploring how queens in Holy Writ act as types and shadows for the Divine Mother. And I'm also hosting a podcast called On Sovereign Wings. On Sovereign Wings is specifically geared towards women who are also associated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in some capacity, not necessarily active, but we talk to women who have experienced sexual assault or sexual abuse, and we interview them about what their healing processes look like. I also collaborate with a sex therapist on that project and an event planner. And so we produce episodes that explore Healing in Depth with the sex therapist, Tasha Diaz. And then May Warner, the event planner, helps us put together meaningful gatherings for these women to connect outside of social media platforms.
I love everything that you're about. And the reason I went, ooh, when you said Women Crowned is because 15 years tomorrow, and this will air later, but 15 years ago, basically this year, I was Mrs. Utah. I was crowned Mrs. Utah. And I've had a whole awakening around why I was drawn to that archetype. And because I'm into Jungian psychology now, so I can look at archetypes.
I love Carl Jung.
I know. Isn't he amazing?
Yes.
I actually just saw his exhibit of the Red Book in UC Santa Barbara, and holy cow. Anyway, but looking at the archetype of the crown, especially for women, I mean, because men, yeah, kings wear crowns, but it means completely something different than it does for a woman. And there's a quote by Louisa May Alcott that I love. She said, I do not seek for any crown but that which all may win, nor seek for any kingdom but just the one within, but the one within, something like that. So I do not search for any crown but that which all may win, nor seek for any kingdom but that one that is within. And I may not be quoting that word for word, but that was sort of my, so it's been 15 years, but around, I would say year 8 post pageant, I was still heavily directing and coaching and everything. And I was like, oh, that's what we actually want, is this queendom within. We just don't know how to access it. So then it took a different tack for me on the whole crowning. But Queen Esther, I'm literally looking at a picture on my desk of a depiction of Queen Esther, Minerva Teichert's drawing, or her rendition.
Her painting, yeah.
And Minerva Teichert didn't even start, I think, painting until she was in her 40s or 50s or something. So anyway, that's kind of a side note, but I love that you're doing that. When can we expect that to be published?
So we're actually taking the project to Kickstarter next month. We've completed 5 out of 10 of our photography shoots, and they're kind of expensive. So we decided to take pre-orders for the book to fund the rest of the photo shoots. So hopefully the book will be out in the world.
Well, I would love to help you promote that. So let's have that conversation.
Okay, thank you. That'd be great.
And by the time this airs, it'll probably be, run its course a little bit, but we can definitely revisit that and see where we're at there.
Okay.
So you have every time I see someone doing amazing stuff, I'm like, okay, they've been through some kind of hell. They've had to go through some kind of like burning, to get to this space where now they can show up in the world and do the healing work they were created to do. They were destined to do. And we kind of titled this episode, Reclaiming Your Power and Identity After Abuse. So whatever you feel to share there, I mean, you mentioned that you grew up a member, and you still are a practicing member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Take us through that again in terms of where we left off with how you were raised and sort of where you went in your adult life.
Absolutely. So I was raised the oldest of 4 children by really terrific parents. They both come from fairly traditional and conservative backgrounds. And even starting at a very young age, I had a pretty wild temperament. My mother loves to tell this story of a tantrum I threw at 3 years old. I, by that point, was known for throwing many a tantrum, and my parents were exhausted and didn't know how to handle them anymore. So one afternoon I started throwing a tantrum, and they put me in my bedroom and locked the door and went outside just to get some reprieve. And they were watching me through my bedroom window. And in a fit of childhood rage, I jumped off of the bed onto the window drapes and pull them off of the wall. So it's pretty funny.
That's a fun visual.
Yeah. So I've just always had a very strong will and a very almost a volatile is kind of not the right word, but I feel things very deeply and very intensely. And once I sink my teeth into something, I'm not very likely to let it go. And so that's been pretty true of my experience as a woman. Starting as a child, I was very sensitive and aware of inequities that I, perceived between my male peers and my little female self, and those things grew and grew, and there was a constant kind of inner battle to between these two sides of myself. The one side of myself, this temper tantrum child, kind of just wanted to, I don't know, fire blast all of the injustices of the world, and the other side of myself wanted to conform and go carefully. And so it's taken a long time to figure out how to bring those two into harmony. And so most of my creative work centers on that particular pain point that I've had almost my entire life, feeling strongly that on an intrinsic level that I am here to do good work, and that I'm important, and that my feminine identity is sacred. But then in my external life, coming up short and having a lack of opportunity and feeling misunderstood. So yeah, maybe that's something you can relate to.
Oh yeah, definitely. So take us to kind of where things began maybe to shift for you or unravel. I mean, it sounds like you had almost an idyllic childhood. It sounds like you had amazing parents, a lot of structure in your faith. But you said you have kind of this like volatility or this strong-willed, and how did that, as you matured, I mean, because obviously you're not 3 years old, you can't go rip the rip the drapes off the wall.
Yeah.
But I see this a lot with women who are trying to develop a purpose. They can look back on their life and go, yeah, I wasn't good with that part. I felt like I had to conform to this part. I felt this rising, like not necessarily anger, maybe, but just passion for, like you said, perceived injustices and maybe going for the underdog. And the feminine in itself is an underdog. And I'm just talking this out as we're kind of moving in this direction, that's what Mary Magdalene did.
Yeah. Yes, she did. Which is one of many things that makes her story so incredible.
Right.
So how did that start parsing itself out? When I moved to college, I started experiencing this surge of spirituality that was on a totally new level than it had been, at least in what I remembered of my childhood and my teen years. I'd always been extremely sensitive, but something about moving away from home kind of put that into high gear, and my relationship with God started becoming very visceral. I'm still adjusting to the new vocabulary, so I'm going to say in our Mormon speak, we call this personal revelation, but it just kind of took off, and I started having a lot of communication that was unexpected and very, very real. And that resulted in me developing a relationship with God that was kind of at the core of who I was. And I started developing a trust in that inner voice that it's hard to break down in this quick interview. But so for all intents and purposes, that trust and that communication started amplifying. And I recall taking a class at BYU. I mentioned I studied theater, and one of the courses that I took covered feminist critical theory in light of the performance arts. And that course really scared me because it resonated. And in my upbringing, feminism was a dirty word.
Yeah, exactly. It was like, oh, mom, those angry feminists. Will they just shut up?
Yeah, exactly. And yet here I was learning this new vocabulary. And so finally, for the first time in my life, I could put words to that passion and that anger and that injustice that I had carried around my whole life. I just never been able to articulate or express it. So here I was, and I was given the language, and I was just full of dread, like one of many crossroads in my life in which I thought, like, oh no, I'm going to get excommunicated.
You heretic. We're all baby heretics. That's why we were born right, like when we were. Just saying.
Yeah, I don't disagree. So it was becoming a pretty oppressive climate internally. I just didn't know what to do. And so I prayed and received a very clear and extremely surprising answer. God told me that I should continue studying feminism. And God was like, and this is me, God, giving you the stamp of approval.
He's like the ultimate feminist, honestly.
Right. I've since come to agree with you on that. But at the time, I was just blown away. Like, what? Like, God would tell me this? Like, so I felt like I was to continue studying feminism, and what's more, that it was going to be really, really important in my life moving forward, that I developed some level of mastery over the topic. And so knowing that I had God's approval was enough to get me to continue. And that's what started a list of creative projects and research and writing on these topics.
Sweet. And so do you mind me asking how old you are?
Yeah, I'm 28.
You're so young.
Yeah, people tell me that sometimes.
That's why I was like, I have to ask her how old she is, because she seems older, but her voice sounds younger, but also very resonant and wise. So, I mean, so you're feeling that God is saying, okay, study more. And feminism is cloaked in just as every parcel of light is cloaked in, negative connotations, just because it's, not understood, or it threatens an existing system or paradigm. So how did you give yourself that permission to explore, aside from you feeling God was saying, yeah, but I mean, you have to also kind of weed through stuff when you dive into feminism, because there's a lot of, there's a lot of angry undertones and misunderstandings. And I think it can be really fear-based. And so how did you come through kind of emerging into adulthood with giving yourself that exploration, and where is it taken you?
Okay. So I think there were two things at the time that helped me to give myself that permission. In addition to feeling really strongly that God himself at the time, it was very much a himself, had given me that permission. The first was, I talked about how a facet of my personality has always been that kind of tempest, that internal tempest.
Feisty.
Yes. Yeah. And so I learned to kind of harness that and channel it into oppressive situations, like that I could take that energy and that strong-willedness and use it to keep myself going through this kind of murky water, or very weeded garden. And the second thing was, I started really practicing vulnerability around the same time. And I started learning, I mean, there were some big slip-ups, but I started learning how to communicate what was going on in my heart in a way that didn't elicit defensiveness from others. Like I said, there were a few slip-ups, but the more I practiced it, the better I got. And that resulted in me being drawn to a lot of women predominantly who were having similar feelings and experiences. So most of the projects I've worked on have been really collaborative, and having a sisterhood to kind of back you up has been irreplaceable in that process.
So what kinds of things are you feeling the sisters needed backing up?
Well, like attending BYU as someone with strong feminist leanings, there were lots of encounters in classes and with peers, and specifically with religious leaders, that could have made me question myself, and in moments where I would maybe be naturally predisposed to backing off or questioning myself, I could go and talk to these sisters and explain, what had happened, and have them kind of remind me of who I really was, and remind me of what I knew was true. And that has been a really needed gift, and one that I'm really grateful for.
Yeah. And I feel like, if the divine is saying to you, go, learn, explore, which we need that permission, even if we're reading the wrong stuff sometimes, we need to put our intelligence into action. And it sounds like you did that, and you got that validation from your community. I was going to say too, that the divine always gives you that community in advance. Whether it's within a family system or religious community or just some kind of cohorts that get you, he'll put that in place. I should say not just he, but she, the divine feminine, they will put that in place for you so that when you get to that crisis, you have something to sustain you and validate what you're feeling. That's certainly, been the case with me. And I think the difference between when I was 28 on the planet, which I've got to do the math, but it's somewhere in the late 90s, to where you're on the planet now as a 28-year-old, there's a different consciousness. And you and I talked about this, but there is literally the sacred feminine, divine feminine, however anyone defines that, is literally streaming through the collective consciousness right now. And the way that it's showing up for people, it's just depending on what system they're in. So they're going to have a manifestation, whatever system they're ascribed to. Again, family systems, religious systems, governmental systems, friendship systems, whatever they're planted in, there is sort of this uprising, which is just kind of a soul cleanse or a leaning towards coming into the feminine. And it's happening with men. That's why we have the Me Too movement. Yeah. It's why there's an anger coming up. It's like, hey, no, we're not going to keep doing it this way. I can't wait to see actually how it emerges with the women who still have to veil their faces in the Middle East, or who can't vote. Or somebody was just telling me, I met a documentary filmmaker who said that, well, actually, no, it was I met a documentary filmmaker over the weekend, but I'm thinking I'm merging her with something my son said, my 17-year-old son. So I'll tell you what my 17-year-old son said. I can't remember what movie it was, but he said, Mom, did you know that there's this lady who's got some kind of Islamic root? I don't know where she lives, but she's somewhere from the Middle East. And she was shooting it in this region of the world. And she had to go to another room to give advice to a man to say, this is the way it should be done, so that the man could go tell the people how it should be done. Because they would not listen to a woman. They would not listen to a woman film director. So it's just things like that. I'm like, that's just really not okay now for many women and men. Because I will tell you that my sons are feminists, and so is my husband. That there's this just sort of, again, this collective uprising. And I think it's beautiful that it's happened to you, and you have the academic backing too, studying feminist critical thinking. So when did you finish at BYU, and where did that take you?
I graduated with my degree in 2013. And I mentioned in our previous conversation that in college, I started dealing with a lot of fairly severe depression and anxiety. And when I graduated, that depression was at its peak. And so I ended up taking a job at BYU because I didn't feel like I had the emotional resources to move very much further away from this community that I built. And I stayed there at BYU for the next 5 years. And the job that I had was a 3/4 time position. And so it allowed some extra time in the week to pursue my creative projects. So I wrote a play and I produced a YouTube series called Splitting the Sky, where my co-producers and I interviewed women and talked to them about their spirituality and experiences that they'd had that had kind of shaped them. And it was a really beautiful time where I was able to continue growing and continue learning and serving this community that I had benefited so much from as a student.
And so when you were producing or creating that YouTube series, did you notice because, I told you this before, but I'm really, really convicted and passionate about letting women share openly about their spiritual gifts or experiences. I've had some really marked experiences in my life, and I didn't always feel safe. Sometimes in church or even with some, outside of church setting with more religious people, it's almost like who does she think she is? Or that's not appropriate. It needs to be in this box. It needs to be approved. How did you see that emerging for some of the women that you highlighted, and you yourself for that matter?
Yeah. So let me think about that. It was a really interesting process, and I think it laid a lot of groundwork for the podcast that I'm working on now, because on the one hand, we could see that there was this hunger to give voice to this essential part of your soul that doesn't have a platform otherwise, like you said, for sharing and for exploring. And so many of the women, when we presented them with the opportunity to be interviewed, were eager to have that experience with us. And some of them were not. They were hesitant and a little fearful about it. And so the more we developed our series, the more we kind of identified that as a demarcation line. And we found that the women who were eager to share were generally at a place of development where they were ready to give voice to those experiences and ready to sort of step into themselves. And the ones who weren't ready. And so we stopped trying to persuade women who felt hesitant or fearful. And we're hopeful that they would watch the series and that maybe that would help them along their way. But yeah, overall, that experience with Splitting the Sky was the name of that YouTube series. Definitely showed me that women have a lot of internal wisdom that doesn't always fit inside a box. And it is an essential part of who they are and how they experience the world, especially if they're women of faith. Kind of like I described that very unconventional experience with God telling me to continue studying feminism. It was a watershed moment for me. And if I want to create real intimacy with another person, they have to understand that and a host of other things about me. And it can be difficult when these parts of your soul, when you feel like they are taboo or not allowed, or simply that there's really no space for you to share them.
Yeah. So and I think it's great and that's why I do this podcast and I know it's probably why you do a podcast and why you did the YouTube series to begin with, is because women learn through community and through the shared voices of other women who, the highs and the lows and the more marked spiritual experiences. Even though we can read them in scripture, we can read past journals of women of faith. I think there is more of that hesitancy and fear, as you talked about, where it's, we want to be accepted. We want to be socially approved in our communities. And so sometimes we kind of have the fear both of maybe seeming too self-aggrandizing, or also a little maybe too big for our britches that way, or also just like, oh, it's too sacred. You shouldn't talk about that. And for me, I've just learned, because I kind of had a similar experience to what you're talking about early on in my education, and it grew and grew and grew, where God didn't say necessarily like learn about feminism as much as he said the divine feminine or mother and what that means. And I didn't ever identify that as relational to Mary Magdalene until much later in life. But I was very drawn to Mary Magdalene in the times in my life where I felt really down, or like I was going through what we call like the dark night of the soul in Christian mysticism, where it's just, you're just down and you can't, you're bound. You can't. And for me, it was literally being in a 1-bedroom apartment in Stockton, California, separated from my 4 kids, and trying to bring this foster baby home and being stuck there. There's nothing I could do. Circumstances were such that I was down. I was imprisoned in this place. The state of California wouldn't let me leave. So I know you and I kind of have talked a little bit in our pre-conversation about, you kind of hit a wall, as you said, coming out of Brigham Young University, and you're sort of like kind of, were maybe prepped with feminist type of theorizing and maybe trying to move it into a spiritual construct. And then you kind of hit this depressive episode. Walk us through what happened after that. I mean, because how long ago was that, by the way? Did you get an undergraduate? Did you finish your studies?
So the timeline was that I finished my bachelor's degree in 2013. And at that time I was really depressed. And so I took that job at BYU and took about 5 years to just heal and recover and work on myself, and had a lot of success, and got to a point where I was doing really, really well. And the vista had kind of opened up to me, and I felt like I was myself again, and was just very excited to move forward. And there was about a window of a year where I was able to create really freely. We finally got that YouTube series off of the ground, and I did a 1-woman play called Mother Wove the Morning by Carolyn Pearson about the divine feminine. And that was a transcendent experience. And
I love her. She's actually one of my heroines in this culture.
Oh, yes. Yeah, rightly so. She's delightful. So, so things looked like they were on an upward trajectory. And then in October of 2017 was when I hit that wall. And it was strange because the depressive episode of 2013 had come about because I had a couple of spine surgeries back to back. And as that was going on, I had a really cherished relationship that went up in flames. And my construct of God also went up in flames as the relationship did. And so we'd rebuilt all of that. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, I got hit with this just extremely debilitating depression, worse than it had been before, anxiety attacks that would kind of knock me onto the ground. But all of it seemed to be coming about without any external stimuli.
And that's how you know it's the dark night experience. I'm just going to throw that in there, because if you read about St. John of the Cross, he's kind of the mystic, early Christian mystic that kind of coined the term. It's when a person of faith has, already kind of forged a divine connection, but that they are then developed enough that they are put into a circumstance where it's literally out of their control, and they have to reconstruct their meaning of the divine and of life. And it's like exactly what you said. It's through externals. It's not brought on necessarily by a quest, your own quest. It just happens. It just shows up to take you deeper.
Ugh, yeah, that's a pretty apt description. But it was a crazy time. And the depression was so bad that I kind of went to God and I was like, I can't even get out of bed. Like, I can't even go to my job anymore. And I was so upset because things have been getting so much better. And I was like, I'm going to leave this town. And anyways, God was like, oh yeah, like I knew this was going to happen. You need to just quit your job without a backup plan. And, I'm like, say what? And then it came again. And I had done so much practice with this strange, mysterious deity that I was able to submit to that relatively quickly, mostly because it was an emergency situation and I didn't see myself having any other option. So I quit my job without a backup plan and was next instructed that I needed to volunteer at the local or I needed to volunteer on the local rape crisis team. And so I started doing those trainings, and that was about all I was capable of doing. I was sleeping 18 hours a day, and not the kind of sleep where you wake up in the morning and your body's sore and you're like, oh, dang, I overslept. That was indulgent. But the kind of sleep where you wake up and you can shower maybe and get a meal in, and then you just collapse into exhaustion again. Strange. So I completed the rape crisis training, and because of what I'd studied in college, I was already pretty familiar with terms like consent and the differences between sexual assault and sexual harassment. And this was more of a refresher course than anything. But this go round, some really unexpected inner demons kind of started popping their heads up out of the sand. And I found myself being triggered by some of the topics we were covering at the training. And then my very first hospital call, I was there with a young woman who had just been sexually assaulted in the emergency room, and she was receiving a vaginal exam. And just being in the room while she received that exam was enough to throw me into a pretty deep place. And by this point, I was beginning to suspect that something had happened to me in childhood. And it all kind of came like a flood after that. And I think that visit to the ER would have been probably the beginning of March or the end of February. And by the beginning of April, the memory of my own childhood rape had resurfaced, and it made perfect sense. As these things typically do once you're there, and it's so strange afterwards that you've been blinded to it your entire life until that moment. But
so how old? So you had, this is, post college, you're sort of trying to get out into the world, which, is an adventure all in and of itself. And you don't have the same communities of support you do necessarily as you would in a structured college environment. And so these memories are coming up, and I'm assuming you had a lot of physiological, that preceded more the emotion before the emotional opening of what had happened.
Yeah. That dark night of the soul that you were describing, a lot of that seemed to be the physiological precursor that led up to the memory. And then after the memory came back, there was a period of about 6 months of numbness, where I didn't feel anything at all. And there were some other extraneous circumstances going on during that time that were kind of preventing me from being able to enter that really tender emotional space. And so as those extraneous circumstances resolved themselves and as time went on, finally I was able to step into the emotional space.
So what were you thinking about yourself, if you don't mind me asking, during this time of numbness and these things that are surfacing? Like what is kind of that self-talk, or how did you self-identify during that time?
I mean, it was a time of just survival. I can't even remember a lot of the specifics of it now. I was going through the motions, and sometimes not even doing that. I didn't have a lot of energy for keeping up a facade. And it was a challenging time, because the metaphor that I use most of the time now is, it was kind of like I had spent most of my life in this beautiful garden, and I'd learned the hard way how to tend it and how to care for it and how to cultivate what I wanted there. And I thought I knew this garden really well because I was the gardener there. And then, after a series of strange months, it was like a mine under the garden exploded, and it just ripped a hole in the center of the garden and set all of my plants on fire. And so those first 6 months, I wasn't even trying to put anything back together. I was just trying to process the fact that there was a mine under my garden this whole time. And so it felt like my mind, like my subconscious mind almost, was working to reconstruct my life narrative. And I just didn't have any extra resources or energy to feel anything or do anything. And so I didn't.
Wow. So that is also very typical of a it's like a post-apocalyptic dark night. To use, because it feels that way to your soul. It's like, who am I? And everything that you thought you knew, or, even the construct of deity. So, because we are deity inside. And so when we feel a severance with who we thought we were, we might misdirect or kind of try to uncover or sleuth through, who am I now, and who is God, and what does this mean for me personally, not just kind of what I've been shown or taught, but what does it feel like for me now? And there does really have to be kind of that reckoning as you develop spiritually, and it's a process we're all still going through. But wow, so that must have been so shattering for you to have this surface. And I'm sure it was probably hard for your family. I'm assuming, because it sounds like you had a pretty protected environment to a degree, of like your parents were really faithful people. And so that had to be really difficult for you to navigate, as well as your family.
It was. And I'm sure you know how complicated family relationships can be. And so when something like this is going out in public, it's important for me to be respectful to stories that aren't mine. And
absolutely.
Yeah. And so as far as my family goes, they're wonderful people, and they have their foibles and their flaws. And that was true in my childhood and is true today. Just the experience of humanity, I think. But
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so as the oldest in my family, I took on a lot of responsibility for my younger siblings and for my parents to a degree. And so it took me probably 6 months of numbness before I was able to even start broaching the topic with my family. And I wanted to do it one at a time, because I figured it would be easier for me to process their reactions individually rather than collectively.
Yeah.
So it took a long time to finally work through the system and share with people. And there were a lot of repercussions for that. And
What do you think? How I want to tie this back to Mary Magdalene, because that's kind of the theme of our kind of where we're going with these episodes over the next several weeks. How did she come into play for you? How did that show up? I mean, because it's one thing to study critical feminist theory, and it's another to have this beautiful figure from, our ancient texts kind of emerge through and come through for you.
Yeah. So you mentioned this experience of, kind of seeing all of the facets of yourself disintegrate. And one of those facets being your own identity as a divine being and your understanding and connection to your divine heritage. And that was definitely true for me. It all disappeared, which was outstanding because it was a very developed muscle for me. And so I think one of the benefits of that process, at least for me, has been that once everything's gone, once the whole structure is burned down, it's a lot easier for God to step in and say, hey, like, that last structure you built was awesome. I loved it. Thank you. But you were missing a few key bits, a few key tresses, maybe. So as we're rebuilding, I want to make sure from the get-go that these parts of the design are present because you need them now. And so as I was venturing through this really dark period where a lot of celestial windows had been closed to me, any light that was getting through was light I was going to receive, and I wasn't going to balk at it. Even if maybe my former self would have been like, oh, this is very hippie, or this is a little too woo woo, or I've mentioned before that there's a voice inside of me that says, you're going to get excommunicated. Those voices don't have a lot of say when it's kind of a matter of spiritual life and death. And so as far as Mary Magdalene goes, I, with my feminist seeking, had centered my personal studies on women in the scriptures for about 7 years, starting in college, and was still deep into that study. And a few months after the repressed memory came back, I had a strong impression, and impressions were rare during this time. I had a strong impression that it was time for me to focus my studies on Mary Magdalene. And I didn't know anything about her really at all, other than that she was often depicted at the tomb with Christ. And so I got on Amazon and I purchased the first recommended book, which is a piece by Cynthia Bourgeault called The Meaning of Mary Magdalene. And it came to my house during a period of pretty intense sickness. My body was purging itself of something. And so I was completely sick and in bed and had nothing to do other than to speed read through the book. And probably because of all of these circumstances, I was just very, very open to Cynthia's message, but also to the Spirit relaying the truths that she had explored in that book to my heart. And one of the facets of my childhood rape that I am continuing to process was, as a child, I mentioned I was very passionate and I was also very romantic. And I think as a child, I interpreted my assault as a romantic encounter in some ways. I mean, I knew that it wasn't, but my brain wasn't really formed enough to make all the differentiations. And so my whole life, I've had this strange, some wires crossed around romantic love. And I keep repeating the same cycle over and over again. That romantic love is being victimized, or romantic love is experiencing pain, and that romantic love is an experience of inequality, these kinds of things. And so considering for the very first time that Christ might have had a counterpart was just completely, it just altered my heart and my being in a way I was not expecting, because Christ was a figure that I had spent many years and a lot of energy of heart to come to know. And he was my closest friend and one of the only men that I really felt like I could trust, and beginning to imagine this extension of his life and beginning to imagine how he would interact with a romantic partner was and continues to be very, very meaningful and special to me.
Wow. And yeah, I mean, I watched the Da Vinci Code. I never read the book, and there was kind of an uprising. I can't remember what time period that was. I want to say early 2000s of, was Jesus married? And I can tell you unequivocally now that he would have, it's just almost self-evident now that he would have had to have been, and who else but her. Just because, I mean, if he's here to fulfill all righteousness and he bears the standard of the sacred masculine and is the fullness of the gospel embodied, he would have, like you said, had to have a female counterpart. He would have had to have that experience. And also just a lot of evidences that Cynthia Bourgeois brings forward about, him being called rabbi, which is the mark of a married man. I think so much was extracted from the scriptures that we have now that's kind of been watered down about the power of the feminine and actually how powerful she was. But Cynthia Bourgeois and other academics and scholars, they kind of explore like the history of the Gnostic Gospels, and her Gospel of Mary Magdalene that was unearthed is just amazing. The Nag Hammadi text that we have. But there's that. And then there's what you're kind of saying too, with just how this, sort of being prepared with God saying it's okay to study feminism. Not only is it okay, but it might be needful for you, given what you're going to be doing with your life. And here, helping people through coming out on the other side of abuse, you would have had to experience abuse. You would have had to climb into that and not just talk about it, but actually experience it in your body. And now, how have you seen that develop? I mean, because you had that initial experience where you read The Meaning of Mary Magdalene, which for all of the listeners here, please read that book. It's amazing. How did you come from kind of just reading about it to actually feeling what Mary Magdalene is to you?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question, and I'm glad you asked it. Yeah, I wanted to say that Mary Magdalene's story is a really interesting one because, and this is true actually of a lot of our ancient texts, if you make it strictly an intellectual exercise, you can build a case in one of many directions.
Yeah.
And that can be really solid, and oftentimes when I share about Mary Magdalene, I'll get comments or feedback that's on that intellectual plane. And I think that's fun and certainly not a bad thing. But for me, this goes so much deeper than that. And it doesn't really matter to me. Like it actually just doesn't matter at all what textual clues or historical tidbits we can cull together to piece together this story, because I feel like on an emotional and spiritual level, the door opened and the connection was made, and so that's really all that matters.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. So moving forward after reading the book, I guess I mentioned that those 10 days of sickness and reading were ethereal, almost otherworldly. And I, without having a conscious awareness of it, I think that door was opened to her. So I mentioned that when I moved to college, my spiritual gifts, I guess you could say, really amplified. And I've always been a very visual thinker, but at some point in my college career, probably near the tail end, started having a lot of revelatory dreams and waking visions. And what I mean by a waking vision is it's kind of like a little video or an image pops into your mind in the middle of the day and sometimes completely unsolicited. Like I might be making hash browns in the morning and suddenly like there's Jesus in my mind and he's communicating something to me. And sometimes it is solicited. Sometimes it's while I'm praying or while I'm meditating that I'll see these images in my mind. But it's not strictly like a video reel. There's always a frequency that's happening in my heart, a feeling of warmth and the feeling of the Spirit.
That's a really beautiful way to put it. That's kind of how you know you're not just making it up. Like,
yeah,
it's coming to you from a divine source, whether it's just symbolism or it's, you're being shown something for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's also typically how I differentiate between hallucinations and visions. So just, to put that out there. Yeah. And so after reading the book, I started having this experience with sovereignty. I had been working on the podcast. I actually started conceptualizing the podcast in October, the same month that I hit that wall, and would feel that sovereignty needed to be a key theme of the work, and was learning a lot through the Spirit about what sovereignty looks like for females, and that it's a key part of who women and men were designed to be. And it's a part of our experience here that has been overridden. And that if I really wanted to be whole as a woman, I had to find that within myself. And so those concepts seem to tie themselves together in a way that really introduced Mary Magdalene to my heart and soul. And what would happen in these waking visions was sometimes, like during my day, I would kind of inwardly reach for Christ. Like I would have a little panic that would come on, or I would have an oppressive thought that would enter my mind. And sometimes like things would trigger me, and then I would take a dovetail into this headspace of a child being raped. And I would reach for Christ in those moments. And in my mind, I would see him like leading a woman in red, a beautiful woman in red, to me. And he would kind of like gesture to her. And what was communicated to my heart was that as much as he loved me and wanted to help me, like I needed to be talking to her. And she was the person who could help me the most. And yeah, so that happened many times and actually continues to happen to this day. I'm a slow learner.
What do you feel like that transmission is about from her? Like, I have my own way. She sort of shows up for me with symbolism and different things that people say. And it's almost like she's like, pay attention to what they're saying. Write that down. How did those transmissions, I think it's beautiful what you're saying. How did you sort of like make them more visceral for you? Or how, I mean, you don't have to give specifics, but just what's that overall feeling you're kind of getting from her?
Well, it's a couple of things. I think on the one hand, being a woman in that ancient time meant that she had a lot of these kinds of experiences that are still plaguing women today, and that she learned how to heal from them, and how to she knows the secrets of liberation, and she knows specifically what they look like for women who are abused. But I think it's more than that. It's like, as radical as this sounds, I really have come to believe that Christ's role as the atoning one is incomplete without his counterpart, and that there is a female contribution or extension to that work that as a female is important for me to tap into and have a connection to. And yeah, and it seems like this is a really critical time in my life where I need that feminine mentorship and that feminine companionship. And it's been pretty empowering to feel like, at least within my own personal realm, that Christ doesn't only acknowledge that, but he kind of enforces it.
Yeah, I think he's got some righteous indignation that she was left out of the picture. I did a podcast interview with my friend Jen Marco where we talked about Jesus table flipping and tradition. And we didn't really go down the road of Mary Magdalene per se, but there's so many things that I'm like you, I perceive the injustices, and it's kind of led me into feminism. And I don't want to be holding up a picket sign. I want to exact change. I want to help people awaken to this. When you're talking about her being the female counterpart, I completely resonate with that. And I do think his work is complete without honoring. I think all constructs and thematics that we have on the earth right now are incomplete if it's just run through a patriarchal system. I think we need the contributions of that wise feminine influence and archetypal, whatever, goddess, queen. It's just where we're at.
Yeah.
So I personally had to give myself permission because I wasn't feeling it. I love what you're talking about, soul liberation, and sort of like Mary Magdalene kind of is who we would look to for what that is, what that actually means. And she taught a lot about love as the liberator. But when we're talking about like owning our voice and saying yes and being human, and coming into that dark descent and then kind of rising up through that. When I was kind of going through that, and I hope I'm on the tail end of it now, because mine kind of came through a series of, when I was a little younger than you, I had a major Abrahamic sacrifice experience. And then 10 years later, my sister committed suicide. And then here I am 10 years later, again, going through a similar, a different level. But it feels like, for me, I just had to give myself that permission and go straight to God. And then God pointed to her. So it's because my paradigm was I had to go through God, which I 100%, I'm not saying not go through God, but it was almost like you're saying there was a deeper connection to the divine feminine that was being overlooked largely. And then, so for me, the permission was like, okay, well, maybe it's not apropos to pray to her, seemingly, but who says I can't talk to her? Who says I can't pour out my heart in my journal and write her a letter or have a conversation with her in my mind? Because that presence needed to be real for me to heal.
Yeah. Yeah. I know I've run into a lot of similar restrictions that sometimes I absorb from the bigger community, like that you can't pray to Heavenly Mother, or that you can't commune with Mary Magdalene, maybe, which probably is even more hipster than praying to Heavenly Mother. But I guess a lot of my experiences, it's like it happens somehow before I even can protest. Like it happens, and then it changes me and it catches me off guard. And then it's like, how could I reject this gift? I can't, not after I've sampled it. And so I talked about
it's kind of like that. If once you wake up, you can't go back to sleep.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And most of the time I can occupy that space in a way that isn't ego-based, that doesn't paint people who profess these restrictions in a negative light. But sometimes that's how I feel. Sometimes I feel oppressed, or I feel like I would be rejected if I were to just pull back the veil completely and fully articulate what it is I'm experiencing on a day-to-day basis. And there's a lot that I don't say for exactly those reasons. Mm. But
really, it's not anyone's business but yours and God's and others.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that sacred honoring of, once you give language to it, sometimes, even by me asking, what were those transmissions? Like sometimes when you give language to something, it really dilutes the message.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like, this is what I experienced as a divine knowing or feeling, and just sort of like a download. And that is personal to you.
Yeah.
But at
absolutely.
the same time, yeah.
No, what were you about to say? You were saying
No, I was saying at the same time, like there would be universal aspects to all of us. In what you receive, maybe there's something super personal, but as a whole, in terms of like soul sovereignty and feminine liberation, there may be some universal aspects to it that would be really validating for other women, and that's probably why you're having you're feeling this compelling force to keep you sharing and talking through the mediums of podcast and art and producing and writing. So you sound like a high creative, but you also have through these series of life experiences, you had to descend and to embody that dark remembering and violation, honestly, of the soul in order to kind of come out, take women on that dark journey with you and how you're coming back into the light. That was really wordy, but kind of just to scale it down, it's just coming from darkness to light, remembering who you really are, letting the divine feminine and Mary Magdalene take you through that, as opposed to just male deity figures.
Yeah. And that's been honestly incredibly critical for me. What's the best way to say? So within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there's a document that kind of codifies our theological understanding of the family. And it claims that gender is an essential characteristic of premortal, mortal, and eternal identity. And, so that's a pretty weighted concept as it pertains to this discussion. And then within the church, there's a strange, what would you call it? Like a paradox or an irony that we teach women that their sex is eternal to them, but then we also communicate to them that they can't have access to the beings who know what that means and who can mentor and coach them to become this full expression of their female identity. And that just kind of broke down for me and doesn't really work anymore. And within my personal realm of authority to make choices and decide which truths I'm going to accept and which I'm not, Mary Magdalene has really stepped forward as that role model and as that mentor and coach. And I do feel like there are certain gifts that she offers me that Christ can't offer me by virtue of being a male, despite the fact that I believe that Christ is the most empathetic male known to mankind and that he understands my experiences. It's something I really value that he acknowledges, like, you need this connection and this sisterhood. And I'm going to affirm that you need it, even though you're going to fight me about it because you don't want to get excommunicated.
Well, and I went through something really similar, especially when I started having children. I'm like, okay, Christ went through everything, even menstruation and childbirth and postpartum. I don't think so. And not to demean his mission or the magnitude of it. But when it comes to a shared experience, yeah, he took on the energy of that, in the garden. But where I see Mary Magdalene as this, the embodied expression of the divine feminine. And the Catholic Church thought that was so heretical that they waged wars. I mean, the Knights Templar, I was out in Europe this last year doing some research on this, and most all of the wars between, these Essenes who were alive and well during Christ's time, who taught the law of love, of which he was born into that community, his mother and his heritage. They were Jews, but they all are also part of this community of Essenes, and taking those sacred writings of the priestesses and everything that was after that, and these communities tried to protect those, and the Catholic Church came in and burned them. And for whatever reason, this is a little deeper to go into, but I will be interviewing someone on the podcast this series later, who talks about, they may have destroyed them physically, but women through the ages have held those records in their bodies. And so this collective remembering now of what these systems tried to take away, that can now come forward. The earth is being primed for that. And it isn't until we acknowledge that it's bigger than just one male way, is going to be the key to letting these things come forward. And when we're talking about, within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I've been an active member my whole life, served in mission and all of those things. And I honor and recognize that those are foundational. They're foundations, but also that we don't remotely even have the fullness yet, which has been acknowledged, and from, the leaders of the church, as well as just how could it be if we don't know everything we need to know about, like, dangle the carrot of Heavenly Mother to us, at the onset of the restoration, but then don't talk about it after that, seems counterproductive to the emergence of feminine gifts and leadership. So that's where I sort of had to kind of like climb and crawl my way into some other construct that fit more where my soul was taking me. So I look at all truth as just a big buffet table, and I'm taking what fits for me and leaving the rest on the table until it feels aligned.
Yeah, that's a perfect description. Mm-hmm.
So, I'd really love everything that you're sharing. I know it's not easy to talk about, being a victim of child rape, and how, you've had to, go through the hell of, the aftermath of the repressed memories coming forward, and putting your life back together, honestly, and reconstruct your identity. How are you doing now? Like, I know you're doing amazing stuff with your podcast, and you're kind of building your own community, which is really powerful. How are you feeling about moving forward, and what's in store for you with what you've learned?
Great question. Well, I mentioned that in 2010, I had a spine surgery and another one in 2011. And I'm really grateful for those experiences because they gave me a very physical template for how healing works that I was experiencing in my body. And there were external symptoms that were measurable and quantifiable. And it took a long, long time to come back to everyday living after having my spine cut open and refused and straightened out. I had scoliosis that was progressing. And so the surgery corrected it, and it was a preventative operation to keep it from getting worse. And I look at this experience with my repressed memory in a very similar light, that some things needed to be straightened, and that I can expect there to be a very, very long recovery process. And I can expect that there are going to be really good days, and there are going to be days where things dip and where I'm in a lot of pain. And that has pretty much been true of what life has been like since discovering this about my childhood self. That being said, I think a lot about the butterfly in my own process. And sometimes I like to imagine what it would be like to be a caterpillar and to have someone come to you and tell you that you're going to turn into a totally different creature and one that has wings that can fly.
Mm.
I'd be flabbergasted. I don't even think I'd believe that person. I'd be, I might just go back to munching on my leaves and crawling at my slow pace on my branches. And yet, like, my own inner caterpillar, very much of its own accord, created its chrysalis. And did you know that when caterpillars enter a chrysalis, that they actually completely break down? They turn into something researchers sometimes call caterpillar soup.
Yeah. Caterpillar soup.
Yeah.
Me and my sisters talk about that all the time. I'm more like, this is a soupy moment right now.
Yeah. Some like eyeballs and antennae floating around in this soup. And that is so much what I've experienced, just a breakdown. And and so lately I've felt like I'm metamorphosizing, I'm reforming. I think my wings have come in, but I haven't quite emerged from the chrysalis just yet. And so on days where things dip and where I'm in pain, spiritually and emotionally, I try to remind myself that someday the chrysalis will open, and that's kind of the point at which life begins again. And so that's how I manage all of that.
Well, we'll end there because I think we're all in the soup, and I don't know that. I think there are parts of us that emerge and fly as the butterfly, and then there's also parts that need to stay in the soup and find their own emergence. But you're very inspiring, and I totally appreciate our time together today. And I will definitely be continuing conversations with you I'm sure in the future, because you're just a like-minded soul. I love where you're going.
Thank you. It's been so nice to chat with you, even just over the airwaves. It feels so nice to hear from someone else who's had similar experiences. Mm-hmm. Before you stop recording, I'm wondering, would it be all right if I told the story of that one particular vision where Mary Magdalene kind of pulled my childhood self into her lap? I realized I didn't tell that one. And
that would be beautiful.
Would that be all right?
Yes.
Okay.
And who's ever editing this, just give them a side note. Can you somehow insert this story back when we were talking about Mary? That would be amazing.
Yes, thank you. I'm so sorry. I'm not being very linear today.
And I only have a couple minutes. I just realized I didn't realize how late it was, and I'm supposed to be somewhere right now. So, but take your time. I'm great. I'm texting them right now.
Okay. I can be brief, I think. One particular waking vision I had of Mary Magdalene was and continues to be very meaningful to me. In the vision, my childhood self was sitting in a room and playing with toys, and she was crying and feeling very broken. And this woman with this long red veil, Mary Magdalene, as I have identified her, came into the space and sat down cross-legged next to this little child. And she pulled my childhood self into her lap and then covered me with this long red veil, almost like a cocoon or a chrysalis. And I felt that she, in particular, was going to help me to heal this wound that I was carrying from my childhood, and almost that she was what I was trying to become, that someday I would be in a position like her and I'd be able to find those broken women and comfort them and protect them the way that she was comforting and protecting me.
Wow. That just gave me the chills. I'm like sitting here going, whoa, I feel that. That's so true. That's so real.
Yeah.
And what a beautiful gift to you coming through in your dark, in your time of darkness, that this is your path. And all the red represents too is phenomenal. We could do a whole thing on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's really, really powerful. And I know it's sacred to you. And I know that it will help a lot of people as well, who may be having things they can't completely interpret coming through like that there's something ahead for them in terms of helping to heal this world through the feminine, through the sacred feminine. So
yeah, you're welcome. I hope you've got enough time to get to your next meeting.
Oh, I'm great. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Amber, for reminding us that sometimes if you've experienced some kind of a trauma or abuse from a male, it's a difficult thing to try to trust and connect to a male figure of the divine, which is why we need both. Boys need their mom just as much as girls. So I've always tried to teach my sons about parent figure of a mother, and just knowing too that she's not just this placid, passive being. She's actually kind of feisty and tempestuous in a way. It's just kind of a fun way to look at it, a real way to look at it. We all have those traits as women and as men to embody the saucy and the passion and the sensuality and all of the things that are associated with our humanness. And that's what the feminine brings, is a validation of our humanness, the realness, the vulnerability, the tenderness, as well as the strong will and the strong passion. You're going to want to tune in next week for our Mary Magdalene series part 3. We've got Chloe Mercer. I met her in England on the Avalon Priestess pilgrimage, and she's this beautiful yogi and just vibrant and alive and so connected to Mother Earth. And she's going to talk about the sisterhood of the rose. And if you don't know what that is, all the more reason to tune in and keep contact with me on the Women Seeking Wholeness Facebook page. We'd like to have more and more discussions around these topics and get the conversation going and further validate those of you who are awakening to this very real and beautiful feminine essence presence. Until next time, I'll talk to you on Women Seeking Wholeness and Mary Magdalene Part 3.